This week, Paul and I interview Ken Johnson, application security engineer at GitHub. In the news, security researchers find a wormable XSS on WordPress.org. The EU is set to fund bug bounty programs for several open source projects, and how Facebook tracks non-users via its Android SDK. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 45, our 46th episode of Application Security Weekly, and Happy New Year. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I'm excited to be joined by my esteemed co-host, Paul Asadorian.
Hey, thanks, Keith. It is good to be here.
2019, we're already off to a great start, as it were, with I think there was the first breach of this year already happened on January 1st. There's all sorts of goodness going on. But in the meantime, of course, RSA Conference 2019, by the way, is the place to be for the latest cybersecurity data, innovation, and #thought leadership. From March 4th to the 8th in San Francisco, we will come alive with cybersecurity's brightest minds as they gather together to discuss the industry's newest developments. Go to rsaconference.com/securityweekly-US19 to register now with using the discount code 5U9 or 9er SWFD or 5 Urban 9er Sierra Whiskey Foxtrot Delta to receive $100 off your full conference pass.
I think they use Utah. Is it Utah? I think they use Utah.
Well, fine.
No, it's not unicorn. It's Utah.
Well,
I was in your defense, Keith. I said something along like ukulele or something, and Doug White corrected me. It's like, it's Utah. It's Utah. All right,
that's true. I remember the last episode of PSW, and he was all over the Niner.
The Niner has to be Niner.
We have one more announcement as well. Check out our on-demand material for some of our previously recorded webcasts, which are now available on demand at securityweekly.com/on-demand. I think I'm on a few of those, Paul, or at least I think I was last year. So. With that, Ken Johnson has been hacking web applications professionally for 10 years and giving security training for 7 of those years. He is both a breaker and builder who currently works on the GitHub application security team. And previously, Ken has spoken at RSA, You Shot the Sheriff, InsomniHack, CERN, DerbyCon, AppSec USA, AppSec DC, AppSec California, AppSec Day Australia, DevOps Days DC, LostCon, Ruby Nation, and numerous Ruby, OWASP, and AWS events about AppSec, DevOps security, and of course, AWS security. Ken's current projects are Weird Al, which is Weird AAL, OWASP RailsGoat, and the Absolute AppSec podcast with Seth Law, which I'll be appearing on later this month. Ken, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. And you mentioned AppSec Day, Melbourne, actually, and that's where you and I met.
Yeah, which is, that was a great time back in October. I know that shortly after you went on an awesome trip to New Zealand, and I ventured off to the wonderful island of Hawaii for some vacation thereafter. So I think we both, preparing for this, we were talking about the excellent opportunities to travel around the South Pacific after attending that conference. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with either New Zealand or Hawaii.
For sure. Especially if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, or, you just like Hawaiian time, as it were. So, Ken, I wanted to first start us off with talking about approaching AppSec the right way. I know that we had a number of conversations at AppSec Day Australia down in Melbourne. And of course, I wanted to kind of kick things off with, the way that you think about AppSec in today's environment, especially with all the things that you see at GitHub.
Yeah, I mean, it's because I think one of the topics that had been brought up were kind of like, I think what are the things that were talked about? It was sort of like, what do you think about bug bounties? What do you think about tooling, dynamic, static tooling? And it's sort of like one of those things where, as with security, everything in security, it always takes multiple layers. It takes a lot of different things. But mostly behind all those things are people. So AppSec, I guess, comes down to really the people that are implementing the program and the developers who are buying into it.
So what you mean to say is I can't just throw like some tools into the build pipeline and just expect them all to get fixed? Like that's just not going to work, really?
Yeah, no, I have a lot of thoughts about that. I don't know if you want to get into it now, but yeah, no, I do have a lot of thoughts about how that is typically done and how that works and what's flawed and what's good and what's bad.
Well, so I know that you've given also, of course, training on doing AppSec, right? Of course, that's what you and Seth were doing when you were down at AppSec Day. So maybe we can start there. Like, what are some of the things that you cover in your course in terms of where do people get started to do AppSec right?
Yeah, so I mean, our course is pretty targeted not for an entire AppSec program, but more so like if you want to get more proficient at source code analysis, right? And that all came about because basically, in talking with Seth and talking with people that would come on the podcast and just at conferences, we realized besides so there are plenty of courses out there for people that are doing like reverse engineering and that sort of analysis, but there wasn't a whole lot out there with people sharing their methodologies for doing source code analysis for web applications. So we put together like essentially how we go about doing reviews. And Jason Haddix is he gives a lot of talks and he teaches a course on the dynamic side of testing, and it's similar in the mindset that he has, that like it's all about methodology. Like, so if you're not finding things, you need to go back to your methodology. It's not magic, it's not wizardry, it's actually very, very boring. It's just following a checklist and having a plan for when you do assessments. So that's mainly what the course is targeted around. So we get into like the manual aspects as well as like how to augment that with tooling, which I think if there's one thing I could leave your viewers with is that context matters. Context always matters. So that tooling is useless if you don't understand the context of the application. So yeah, the best way to explain that is if you're told, hey, review the results of this scanner, but you've only got 48 or 72 hours to do this, and you're not going to get any context on this massive application. It's generally a waste of time. Need to know the application that you're reviewing results for, obviously, to put into to understand what you're looking at.
So what are some,
sorry? So I just had a question. I thought this was a good juncture to delve into it kind of early on. The question burning in my mind is, covering security like we do here at Security Weekly, we've seen a lot of bugs in open source software, specifically in projects and or libraries like the kernel, where the code's been there for years. I mean, in some cases, 10 years, but no one ever found the bug. Ken, is that because no one was really looking for it, or is that because they didn't really have a good plan to know what to look for? Or both? Yeah,
I mean, in open source, you're kind of, if you don't have the if you don't have a dedicated team, or I think Rails, for instance, has a bug bounty program. If you don't run a bug bounty program, or you don't have any sort of like real security program, and you're just relying on volunteers, it's no surprise to me that it goes unnoticed for some period of time. But I think that brings up a good point about when you talk about an AppSec program, is like having good, honestly, a very good inventory and asset management process in place, just so that if something like that's been laying around for years or months or whatever is discovered, exactly where it's running, and you can get that updated and you can contact the right folks in a timely manner. So that's always like for anyone starting an AppSec program, your first 30, 60 days, you should be doing that, investing in that.
I completely agree, Ken. I think that's great advice.
So, of course, in some of that as well, for teams that they need to try and get the right context, is that sitting down with the developers? Is that sitting down with the users of the software to get an idea of what the user process really looks like? How do you recommend security professionals? Heaven forbid they talk to their colleagues, right? But how do you recommend that they get the context that they really need so that they can make good decisions about the security implications of different vulnerabilities that maybe they've discovered via tools or otherwise?
Yeah, you ask a really good question, and I'll pull up the checklist here. It's like we leave people with even just a basic handout for going about sort of the process of doing what we're talking about here. So it is definitely sorry, I'm going right to this template because it's easy, and I can put the link in here if I can. Yeah, let me figure this out. All right, so that template's very basic, but you get to know the behavior. You get to know the behavior of the application, like what's the business purpose, what customer base is it applying, like what does that application apply to? Types of information, but the tech stack. The tech stack's a big one, right? Like knowing the back end, knowing the framework that it's built on, the language, all of the components, any widgets, all that comes into play. And then sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. Continue.
Okay. And then, sorry, I thought I heard someone. So, and then brainstorming. And by the way, yeah, you're definitely like hitting on a point that we talk about in the course, which is like, you should definitely talk to the developers. Like you should talk to anybody you can who has a grasp on what you're about to look at, because that's the quickest way to get up to speed. And when you talk about brainstorming, that's where some of those ideas come up. Sometimes it's just through looking at the tech stack. You're like, hey, this is MongoDB. So maybe there's no SQL injection here. So yeah, you're right. You definitely want to talk to developers. That's going to speed things up, or anyone that you can that knows the application. But this is just a very basic sort of look at what we delved into, which is, like you said, how do you get to know the application? It's amazing, like what you can do in an hour to figure out what an application is and what it's made up of, and like do the things you're looking at, like even if you're just going to look at scan results, you can figure out a lot more about what matters in a quicker time frame if you follow a methodology like that.
So are there any open source methodologies out there today in terms of maybe, I don't know, OWASP checklists or things of that nature that you also recommend others go back to, whether it's writing code or even thinking about the architecture of the application?
There is, and I'm blanking on it right now. I want to say there's I think the ASVS has been recommended.
Yep. We spoke with Daniel Cuthbert, trying to remember the episode number, last year about the ASVS and other things as well.
Yeah, I say it's been recommended. I mean, to say that, I'm pretty sure in our course we talk about it a bit. I just don't remember the abbreviation. So
got it. No, it's all good. It's all good. I think there's one other one as well that I've been referring a lot of developers to lately, which is the secure coding practices cheat sheet that they also have from OWASP as well. Which the two of them combined, basically on my experience, and I don't know, Ken, if this is mirrored by your own experience, but when you take those kind of tools together and you say, all right, ASVS is thinking about what your application does and how sensitive it is, and here's the checklist of the security things that you need to make sure you're doing to meet that ASVS. Now, granted, ASVS isn't like held by PCI or anybody else that's going to audit you for it, but I've seen that be a wildly successful way of turning around developers to focus on security. I don't know if you've had the same experience based on your recommendations.
So, actually what's been like, in terms of really helpful for our developers, one thing that's really interesting is, like, if you have the opportunity to run a bug bounty program, it's actually really fun to go back through and go through some of like the you're going to have like reoccurring themes if you're maybe not. We have reoccurring themes sometimes, like for a period of time. It's like, okay, these types of bug bounty submissions that are really good fall under this sort of category. So it's always fun to go back and do like a post-mortem, here are the cooler submissions that we came across. And it's actually interesting because it's something that, it's real. Somebody found it who wasn't, who didn't have access to source code, who wasn't, I guess it's not necessarily true because you can reverse GitHub Enterprise, but for the most part, right, they're not an insider. So it's somebody outside the company that found this stuff. So that's always very interesting. Guides are great. We do have, an internal training requirement to review a guide once a year. But I really feel like if you can relate to it, and it's, I don't know, I just feel like you can relate to real stuff better. And it helps kind of stick and becomes interesting.
So speaking of things like trends, I know that when we were preparing for this, we did want to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing in the industry broadly, right? Like not specific to the bug bounty program at GitHub or anywhere else for that matter, but just some of the things that you are kind of seeing on the horizon as taking off from a vulnerabilities perspective. I know that you had a couple of thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. Like, so the big one that we've seen, when I say we, I mean AppSec in general has seen, is server-side request forgery. That's really been a big one. I can only speculate on the reason for that. I mean, one reason I think it might be is that you have, like now you've got a lot of systems making calls to each other, right? Everybody's doing the microservice thing, or like basically handling various components of what would be the monolith into different applications, and then making requests off amongst them, amongst the different applications. So you've got these requests going out, and often they're controlled by the user, right? Shouldn't be, but the user has the ability to somehow manipulate where that request goes. And so now you've got, a user basically making requests internal to your infrastructure through the front end web application. So that's, like SQL injection was really popular. Well, I think right now SSRF is super popular.
So for our listeners, right? I mean, you and I could probably wax poetic on SSRF all day, but for the listeners out there, why is that so bad? I mean, if you've got a microservices architecture and you've got a server that can make requests internally, it's microserviced off from pretty much everything else, or at least it should be. So what could you actually do with that? Like, again, depending on the scenario that maybe you would set up.
Yeah, like one thing, again, going back to Jason Haddock's, he put out this really good list of different, so if you have the ability to make a request to a URL and get the response back, he put out this list of, essentially it's the metadata endpoints. So like if you've got an EC2 instance and it'll have like a URL locally running on it that only it can, it's just a local URL that only it can access on itself. That has credentials, and those credentials often, they rotate. But those credentials relate to a role. So whatever role is attached to, say, for instance, an EC2 instance, then if you're able to, have an application, make that request locally where it grabs those credentials from that URL running on EC2 instance, for however long, if it's another 12 hours before it rotates, you've got the ability to use those credentials in whatever fashion that role has access to inside of AWS. And that's Google Cloud, that's Azure, that's everyone.
So other than server-side request forgery, so once you've got that, are there any others that come to the forefront of things that you're seeing? I know that for me, the one thing that I've always I'm getting more worried about more often than not is both server-side template injection is kind of the other one. So not the same as request forgery, but again, the ability to kind of control the way that the site is rendering things, especially in the world where we have basically engines running on the back end via Node to do some of these things, which again has system level calls depending on the way that you've hardened Node. But also blind SQL injection is kind of the other one that seems to be making more of a resurgence lately. I don't know. Are you seeing the same things, or is that are those kind of falling off the radar on your front?
So for the first one, SSTI, no, I'm seeing an uptick in that, and that's I think Tim Tomes put out a few articles that were pretty good, or maybe a couple articles pretty good on the on like Flask and server side template injection in Flask, or just using that as an example. But also like, is it Mustache, or it's these front end JavaScript templating languages are famous for it. But templating languages in general, depending on how you use it, given that. Okay, so this is my anecdotal sort of thought on this. As more frameworks come out, as things become more standardized, well, somewhat more standardized, and there's all these like frameworks for front end JavaScript, or for, whatever it may be. These templated sort of standardized languages, you're going to see that kind of stuff happen because it's running application code in a view. And if that becomes user supplied input, you're asking for a really bad time.
Yeah, so Tim's the one that I actually learned a lot of template injection stuff from back when I took one of his classes, his practical web application penetration testing class. So shout out to Tim for that. But the other thing that you see is beyond Flask as well is Angular JS especially is super vulnerable to things like that as well. And I think there's a whole set of sandbox escapes that Portswigger has listed around different versions of Angular JS and the sandbox itself, and then the template injections that you can get from being able to break out of that sandbox itself. So I agree with you, Ken, to the extent that as we go into 2019, we're starting to see, of course, even more JavaScript frameworks, but they're usually breaking down to one of a handful of the different template languages, whether it's Jinja 2 or Mustache, or I guess that's Handlebars, or any of those other different just template languages or template frameworks out there. It's going to get worse, I feel like, before it gets better, just because we're moving so fast. And kind of, moving on to...
so Keith and Ken, what's your recommendation for, let's say you had a Python Flask application, just let's go with that, and you wanted to have a user interface that was a lot more usable than what Flask lets you natively, what would be your recommendation?
So I have thoughts on this, Ken, but go first.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Ken, please go first.
Okay, so what I would say is that it just depends. It's all contextual. So if you, for instance, if you need to have certain elements, there's always the same kind of. It doesn't matter if it's like, hey, this person should be able to input, the names of these files. I just came across this where it was you provided a name of a file, it looked in a folder. And it didn't just look in that folder, but if it was in that folder, it would render it and do it dynamically and integrate it into this layout. But obviously I'm bringing it up because it didn't end there. It was, you completely had the ability to escape that directory and navigate out and include other files that shouldn't be included inside of this layout, including source code and stuff like that. So whether it's that or it's like saying, hey, certain functions should be accessible, it all comes down to, like, in my opinion, often the solution is just like a whitelist. Like, for instance, in that situation, you could have easily just said, hey, within this directory, list all the files. If the file that they're providing me matches this file, then cool, render it. Otherwise, don't.
And Ken makes a really good point, which is when it comes to Python Flask specifically, or really any templating language, that when you have an opportunity to validate the input that comes through, do it. And to the extent that you should whitelist, that's absolutely the best scenario in any of these situations. Mm-hmm. But actually, Paul, in my own experience with the InfoSec Mentors project, which is written in Flask, that's exactly what I did, right? Mm-hmm. So I allowed people to give a name, right? Whether it's a handle or their real name. So there are certain character sets that I'm willing to accept, and up to a certain length, right? So there's kind of defense in depth that you can use there as well. So maybe it's just alpha characters, spaces, and a single period, right? So if they wanted to abbreviate middle initial, for example. But you can pretty readily understand input fields or acceptable inputs as long as you know what's supposed to be allowed per field, and then you're very stringent about the character length, but also the type of input that can be given there.
So from a security perspective, there are different technologies, but you have to, in all cases, make sure that you're sanitizing user input, which, I mean, goes without saying if you're building an application, especially one that's public facing to the internet.
Yeah, 100%.
I think it gets incredibly difficult these days just because, so like, there's this concept we've had around for years now, which is dry, don't repeat yourself in code. And you mentioned it, Keith, you'd said, as we're moving so fast, and that's kind of the reason for a lot of these things, right? Is that we're trying to make our applications flexible and rewrite code on the fly and render code on the fly, and essentially like write minimal amounts of code and let a lot of the processing and decision making lie with whatever input comes in, right? Like whatever's provided, whatever variables come up. And so as that continues to increase, we are seeing like more serialization flaws, remote code execution flaws, serialization that leads to RC itself, template injection, SSRF, things like that.
And in my mind, it's one of those things where if you have, again, like well-defined inputs or anything that's acceptable from a user standpoint, right? Like if it's a field that a user can submit, it should be sanitized in some way, whether that's an acceptable list of character space or character types, or a well-defined list of things that it can call, right? I mean, I'm sure that Ed Scotus and the team over there at Counter-Hack Challenges has probably got a whole host of details that they can share with us on this sort of thing, because again, of all the things they did with the Holiday Hack Challenge around terminals and acceptable inputs and containerized environments and things of that nature that they would spin up as part of the game, right? When you have a host of hackers that you're trying to get to go through these hacking challenges, you bet that there's going to be some of them that are going to try and break out of that environment. So you got to be very careful about what you take in for input and where. Go ahead, Paul.
For sure. I just gonna say for sure.
Continue, Keith. Sorry.
So I was actually going to say, Paul, unless you had any other additional questions, I had 5 more questions for Ken.
No, let's do it.
All right. So Ken, are you ready for the 5 questions with Application Security Weekly?
Oh, I think I was supposed to have. Okay. Yes. I'm prepared, just like I should be.
What were the specs like on your first computer?
It was oh my God, I don't remember. It was like a PC. It was one of those what's got the cows on the gateway PCs.
Yeah,
cow on it. Yeah, that's my actual computer that I own. Not the first one I worked on was like a original Macintosh at school, in elementary school.
Did it have one of those like really cool like the different colored like shells around the monitor? So it was like an orange or a green or a blue.
No. This is before that. This is when it just like was just the bland beige that just came out.
Right on. So given the day and age that it was, what programming language did you learn first?
Oh, I mean, I learned Bash first, which I don't know if anyone consider. Maybe that's like I don't know if people consider that.
It counts. It totally counts.
It does? Okay, cool. So but after that, the one I've invested myself the most in is Ruby. But I've learned I've dabbled with a lot of other languages since then: Golang, Node, et cetera, Java, all that stuff.
Nice. So as you were writing code, and especially that you were doing some stuff with Bash, got to ask, Vim or Emacs?
Vim. And it's only because that's the first one I learned, and that's it.
Then you just stopped. You were good there. So the other question that I have, though, is since it wasn't Python that you were writing in, it's probably less of a deal, but spaces or tabs?
You know what? If it was Python, yeah, I'd probably stick to tabs just for easeability, because it's. But I'll tell you, like if that's a concern on your development team, consider yourself lucky. You got it figured out. You're good. And the rest of us, nice. We got other things to worry about. So, but it's an interesting. Yeah, I think tabs if I was going to be writing Python.
There you go. Right on. And last one, which I think is poignant given your experience as a teacher. What sort of advice would you give to newcomers in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, people are what make up this whole thing. I mean, you need to network, and it's hard because I'm actually a pretty introverted person. And I've got to like force myself to really get out there and do stuff like podcasts and go speak and stuff like that, which scares me to death every time. But you need to do it. You need to go meet people, go to meetups, and because you can do as much, you can read all the books you want, but it's a small community. The longer you're in it, the more people you pretty much you know and rely on, and we all work either for each other or with each other at some point. So
that is absolutely true. With that, we are going to take a short break and then come back with the news. Thanks, Ken, for joining us.
Thanks, Ken.